We're going to continue talking about acid-base physiology. In this lecture, we'll focus on the metabolic acidosis. And as we know, acidosis implies a pH that's less than 7.35, and that depicts a higher hydrogen ion concentration within this solution. And because it's metabolic, we know that the primary process is a decrease in the bicarb concentration. Because in the previous discussion we said that the primary respiratory pathology involves the PaCO2, and the primary metabolic processes involves the bicarb. So since this is metabolic acidosis, the acidosis implies a pH that's less than 7.35, and the metabolic process involves the decrease in bicarb. So if we look at the more detailed graph of the acid base, we can say that metabolic acidosis, as we said before, implies a decrease in bicarb. And we know that the compensation or compensatory mechanism is going to be initially through the pulmonary system through a process of hyperventilation to blow off the PaCO2. So the initial compensatory mechanism will be the pulmonary process of hyperventilation, and later a more effective way to compensate for this metabolic abnormality is through the kidneys, in which we'll talk about how the kidneys reabsorb the bicarb and excrete certain acids, and certain urinary buffers will help, such as the phosphate and the ammonia ions. So we can say that the bicarb is the primary abnormality in metabolic acidosis. So you have a decrease in bicarb that can be caused by the consumption of bicarb, in which the bicarb buffering capacity is exhausted, for example, through an ingestion of strong acid or a production of strong acid within the body. And it consumes the bicarb and therefore exhausts the buffering capacity of bicarb. Another example can be bicarb wasting, either through some pathology in the kidneys, for example, renal tubular acidosis, or some pathology that's taking place within the tubular function that can no longer reabsorb the bicarb, will therefore waste the bicarb because it's no longer able to reabsorb the bicarb. An example of GI would be, for example, diarrhea. Massive diarrhea, vomiting, may decrease your bicarb concentration. Or you can have a decreased bicarb concentration through dilution. If you were to infuse a lot of intravenous fluid, for example, IV fluid such as normal saline, that's free of bicarb, many liters of normal saline may lead to a decreased bicarb concentration and therefore metabolic acidosis, instead of treating the patient with something that contains bicarb, for example, lactated ringers. So the next thing that we look at to try to figure out what form of metabolic acidosis we have, we can look at the anion gap. And the anion gap, by definition, is the major plasma cations, or the positive charge, within the plasma, subtracted by the major plasma anions that contain a negative charge. And we generally say that sodium is the major plasma cation, and the major plasma anions are chloride and bicarb. So, for example, if your chloride was 103 and your bicarb was 24, with the normal value of sodium being around 140, you can say that the anion gap can be around 13 milliequivalents. And the normal value of the normal anion gap is about 7 to 14 milliequivalents. And we can use this to determine if the acidosis is due to an increased anion gap or a normal anion gap acidosis. So if we first look at the increased anion gap acidosis, we can recall that the mnemonic mud piles helps to explain certain pathologies that may increase the anion gap acidosis. And that basically implies a strong acid that's being either produced or consumed within the body. So, for example, the increased production of endogenous non-volatile acids can be because of renal failure. It can be from diabetic ketoacidosis or starvation, which produces ketoacids, or it can be a situation in which the cells are hypoxic and no longer using metabolism effectively through the glycolysis and TCA cycle, but instead stops and produces only pyruvate and lactic acid and doesn't enter to the TCA cycle, and you have an increased formation of lactic acid, and therefore you would have an increased anion gap acidosis. Certain ingestion of toxins that can be considered as almost acid form are methanol, ethylene glycol, formaldehyde, and so on and so forth. So here you can use the mnemonic mud piles, for example, methanol, uremia, diabetic ketoacidosis, formaldehyde, and so on and so forth, lactic acidosis, ethylene glycol, helps to create that mnemonic mud piles. And that explains the increased anion gap metabolic acidosis. For a normal anion gap acidosis, you can think of it as hyperchloremia, an increased concentration of chloride in respects to the other ions. And you can get that primarily through either a GI or a renal loss of bicarb. And as we said before, a massive form of diarrhea or vomiting may lead to an increased loss of bicarb. You can have, for example, renal tubular acidosis, some type of tubular abnormality that's no longer able to reabsorb the bicarb and therefore waste the bicarb within the urine, and that implies a renal loss of bicarb. And other situations such as dilutional, TPN, and chloride-containing acids may lead to a normal anion gap acidosis. So therefore, the treatment for metabolic acidosis, the first thing implies treating the underlying cause and the processes. And that helps using this anion gap formula to figure out, do you have an increased anion gap and therefore treating one of these conditions? For example, diabetic ketoacidosis requires massive fluid hydration, insulin and glucose, and careful titration of blood sugars to normalize the blood sugar, versus lactic acidosis may require adequate fluid hydration to promote, to eliminate the hypoxia that may be creating the lactic acidosis. So you want to monitor how well oxygenated are the cells and follow an arterial blood gas. And you may want to treat and reverse certain toxins that may be creating your increased anion gap acidosis. Or if you determine that you have a normal anion gap acidosis and you're losing bicarb via GI system, such as diarrhea or vomiting, you're going to treat certain situations. So that's how the anion gap helps to determine if you have an increased anion gap acidosis or a normal anion gap acidosis, and therefore gives you hints how to treat the underlying process. You may need to control the ventilation if a patient's in metabolic acidosis. One way to compensate for the acidosis is to hyperventilate a patient, in which they blow off the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So the initial compensatory mechanism is pulmonary through the hyperventilation. So you may require mechanical ventilation to hyperventilate a patient in which their PaCO2 is in the low 30s millimeter of mercury. And later, the more efficient way to compensate for metabolic acidosis is through the kidneys. And we can show how the kidneys basically reabsorb bicarb and hopes to regulate the pH system. So once again, we said that the bicarb can be reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule that receives the ultrafiltrate from the glomerulus. Bicarb can be reabsorbed through a process of carbonic acid being dissociated and therefore being reabsorbed back into the capillary system. Also, you can eliminate certain acid, for example, hydrogen ions, through urinary buffers. For example, phosphate and NH3 can be formed and form the H2PO4 and NH4, which can no longer be reabsorbed and therefore are excreted within the urine and act as urinary buffers to help compensate for metabolic acidosis. In the next lecture, we'll talk about metabolic alkalosis, and the compensatory mechanisms that help regulate the pH in metabolic alkalosis. And then following that, we'll talk about respiratory alkalosis.